I would now like to welcome Dr. Judith Elkins.
I'm going to really try to focus on the science and the rationale behind changing school start times for middle and high school students. But I also want to share with you some of the research that has been done that has shown what happens when you do change school start times. And I think that that body of evidence is pretty compelling at this point. And then at the end of the presentation, I'll be happy to take questions that you might have as we go through this. So I'd like to start out with some common myths and misconceptions that I hear all the time. I give a lot of these talks around the country. And hopefully I will address all of these in the course of the next half hour, 40 minutes or so. But these are common comments. Teens would go to sleep earlier if their parents just made them do it. So this is an issue of limit setting, poor parenting, etc. Some teens might need 9 hours of sleep, but mine does just fine with 6, and so do I. Take the cell phones, TVs, iPads, laptops away, and kids will fall asleep. If school starts later, they'll just stay up later. And if school lets out later, they'll just have to cram in the same amount of stuff in even less time. Teens can just make up for sleep loss during the week by sleeping late on weekends, or even potentially going to school later one day a week. Kids need to learn to get up early, and they'll survive. So let's explore that a bit. Forgive me for delving a little bit into kind of background science for a few minutes, but I think that there are some concepts that are very important to recognize as the underpinning for the rationale for looking at this issue in adolescence. So there are essentially two processes which regulate when we sleep and when we're awake. The first of these is what we call the sleep drive. And this appears to be a result of the accumulation of certain neurochemicals in the brain which are somnogens. In other words, they promote sleep. So when we wake up in the morning, our sleep drive is fairly low because ostensibly we've gotten a reasonable night's sleep, but it continues to build in a fairly linear fashion throughout the course of the day, and then is eventually dissipated over a night's sleep. Now the other process which governs how alert or how tired we feel at any given time of the day is what we call the circadian drive to wakefulness. And the biomarker of this is melatonin levels. So this is a predictable 24-hour pattern of relative sleepiness and alertness that occurs throughout the 24-hour day. So our circadian drive to alertness is fairly low in the morning, but because our sleep drive is also low, we feel fairly alert. There's a burst of energy kind of in the late morning, early afternoon, and then a slump around 3 to 5 in the afternoon where we tend to reach for our cup of Starbucks because we feel naturally a little bit sleepy. Then there is a burst of energy, of alertness, which we refer to as the second wind phenomenon or the forbidden zone, which is a surge in circadian-based alertness in the hour or so before our bodies are ready to fall asleep. So it's very difficult to fall asleep during that time. And probably the biological reason for that is to allow us to stay up a little bit later in the face of an accumulating sleep drive. And then there's what we call the circadian nadir, which is the lowest point of alertness in the 24-hour day. that's around 3 to 5 in the morning when most of us are fast asleep, so we don't notice it. Now, keep this graphic in mind and think about this shifting later by about 2 hours. And we'll have a little bit better sense of what happens in adolescence. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that it's not just how much you sleep, but when you sleep, that are what we call biological imperatives. So we've known about this master clock in the brain for quite some time, in what's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this is a big part of what governs our circadian rhythms. But what we now know, and this is what won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2017, was that there are circadian clocks in every cell in the body. And so all of these clocks need to be synchronized with each other. Think about what happens when you have jet lag. All of these clocks kind of go awry and they readjust at different time intervals. So misalignment between these internal circadian clocks and the external cues in the environment, principally of which are light and darkness, results in profound impairments in physiologic function and health. And that's the piece that I think is sometimes underappreciated. We tend to focus on amount of sleep, but the timing of sleep is equally, if not important. So what about adolescence? What happens to normal sleep development that raises concerns in regards to how much sleep and when teens are sleeping? And this includes both middle and high school students because these changes are linked to pubertal development, as we'll see. So the first thing is that all adolescents experience some degree of what is essentially a normal shift in circadian rhythms with age, but particularly in association with the onset of puberty. So the result of this is a biologically based shift or delay of up to several hours, not only in the natural fall asleep time, but in the wake time as well. And on a practical level, because of that forbidden zone timing just before our bodies are ready to fall asleep, this means that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the average adolescent to fall asleep much before 11 p.m. on a regular basis. You can put a teen to bed at 9, but you can't make them sleep. And teens can't make themselves fall asleep earlier. Now, of course, there are a number of environmental factors which further exacerbate this situation that we also have to pay careful attention to. And those include competing priorities for sleep, like homework, after-school employment, in particular, screen time. Because we know that the blue light that is emitted from screens like television screens, laptops, etc., exacerbates the delay in the body's release of melatonin in the evening. It suppresses melatonin. And it makes the delay in bedtime, the difficulty falling asleep earlier, that much more difficult. So when we think about these later naturally based wake times, these biological changes are really in direct conflict with earlier middle and high school start times. And 8:30 is emerging as the sweet spot. In other words, school start times much before 8:30 are not as conducive to sufficient sleep and appropriately timed sleep as school start times before 8:30. So, as a result, students are required to wake for the day and function at their optimal level during what is for them the circadian nadir. So it's like asking all of us to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be ready to go, be ready to learn in the classroom. In addition to that, we know that what's called REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, sometimes referred to as dream sleep, is concentrated in the last third of the night. And if you have to wake up too early, you're going to be selectively deprived of REM sleep. And why is that important? REM sleep is critical for learning, particularly learning of new information and new tasks. And obviously that's a huge part of what we expect students to do in the classroom. So what many of my patients do, many adolescents do, is they try to make up for insufficient sleep during the week on school nights, and they sleep in later on the weekends. So we see this increasing discrepancy between bedtimes and wake times on school nights versus non-school nights. And is this really adequate compensation for the sleep loss that students experience Monday through Friday? I would argue strenuously that the answer is no, because it doesn't address the compromise in alertness that these students experience during the week, and doesn't reverse the impairments associated with insufficient sleep the rest of the time. And furthermore, this practice of weekend oversleep leads to further exacerbation of this circadian shift or circadian phase delay. And they've actually done studies where they've measured melatonin levels when they go up in the evening and going to bed later and waking up later on the weekends further worsens that situation of delayed melatonin release. And think about it, if you sleep until noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday, you're not going to be able to build up a sufficient sleep drive to fall asleep at a reasonable hour come Sunday night. And that results in a phenomenon which we now call social jet lag. So as I mentioned earlier, think about how you feel when you're jet lagged, and it affects all these circadian clocks all over your body. And we know that the adjustment in terms of jet lag takes 1 day per time zone crossed. So these students are in a essentially permanent state of jet lag, and just as they start to recover from that, the whole process starts all over again. So the bottom line is that for optimal, and we all want what's optimal for our kids, right? It's health, safety, and achievement. The average middle and high school student needs 8 to 10 hours of sleep. I cite a couple of examples here which aren't at all unusual. In a couple of high schools in districts in Massachusetts, 52% of students were getting less than 6 hours of sleep on an average school night. And in another high school, 82% were getting less than or equal to 7 hours of sleep, 41% less than or equal to 6 hours sleep, and less than 1 in 5 were getting the recommended 8 to 10 hours. And this is just This has been shown over and over and over again. These are not unique communities. This is the status quo in the United States, in middle and high schools these days. So what are some of the effects, the real world effects of deficient sleep on performance, health, and safety? The first and third leading causes of death in adolescents are accidental injuries, which include motor vehicle crashes, and suicide. And mistimed and insufficient sleep, we know, are directly related to those two causes of mortality in adolescents in the United States. So let's delve into this a little bit more. So impact on the brain. So this concept of deficient sleep, which includes both not getting enough sleep for your sleep needs and mistiming of sleep according to your internal circadian clock, we know impacts cognitive functions, and in particular what we call executive functions. So these are things like decision-making, problem-solving, organization, planning. And we also know that executive functions, the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which governs these functions, is at its most rapid phase of development during adolescence. So at a time when this part of the brain is really developing, we're exposing the brain to essentially what is a toxin in terms of the impact on these executive functions. Deficient sleep also affects attention, memory, mentioned the learning of new tasks, emotional regulation, and particularly alarming, risk-taking behaviors. Because people who don't get enough sleep tend to take more chances because they perceive less in the way of negative consequences for their behavior. And that level of poor impulse control and poor decision-making is directly impacted by sleep. Sleep also has what we call a neuroprotective effect. So we know that sleep loss directly has an impact on neuronal functions, including something called neuronal plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to change structure and functioning in response to the environment. It affects gene activation and expression in neurons in the brain. It makes the brain less able to protect itself or repair itself from injury. And recent evidence has found that there is something called the glymphatic system in the brain, which essentially eliminates toxins that have accumulated during the day and allows the brain to have a clean slate from which to work. So there is no substitute for sleep because this process only takes place during sleep. Sleep is not a waste of time. It's an absolutely critical biological process. In terms of health, we know that deficient sleep is associated with an increased risk of obesity. It's associated with poor cardiovascular health, including a risk for hypertension and stroke. It's associated with metabolic dysfunction, including an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. And particularly important in the adolescent population, clearly associated with both depression and an increase in suicidal thoughts, as well as a risk for alcohol and substance abuse. In terms of safety, drowsy driving, we know that young drivers are involved in a substantial percentage of fatigue-related traffic crashes every year. And those crashes are underestimated. Number one, because oftentimes law enforcement officials don't ask about sleep as a factor in a crash. Unfortunately, because the individual is asleep and makes no attempt to avoid the crash, these crashes are more likely to be fatal. And there is no breathalyzer test for sleepiness. So it's a challenge to tease out really what the contribution of drowsy driving is to the high level of motor vehicle crashes in adolescents. We conducted a survey back in 2015 of high school drivers in Fairfax County, Virginia, which had a school start time of 7:20, and almost 50% of the students reported drowsy driving. And the prevalence was considerably higher, as you might imagine, in students who were getting less sleep. Just some data that I saw the other day from Massachusetts Department of Public Health reported that 10% of white adolescent student drivers in high school reported drowsy driving in the past year, and alarmingly, for reasons that we don't quite understand, is more than twice the number of Hispanic students reported drowsy driving as well. And we know that the impairments related to sleep loss are equal or greater than those due to alcohol intoxication. And this was some work that we did a number of years ago, in which we took residents, medical residents, and we tested their performance on a driving simulator when they were well rested, when they were after being on call at night. And the third condition was we gave them enough alcohol to raise their blood level to moderately intoxicated. And they performed as badly or worse in the sleep-deprived condition as they did when they were moderately intoxicated. So as a parent, you would never allow your teenager to get behind the wheel knowingly if they had consumed 3 or 4 beers. And yet, when these kids drive themselves to school in the morning and coming back in the afternoon, that's essentially what's happening. We also know that insufficient sleep is associated with behaviors that also further increase the risk of car accidents. Things like not wearing a seatbelt, not using a bicycle helmet, an increased risk of texting and driving, or drinking and driving. Sleep loss is also associated with an increased risk of pedestrian injuries in children. Is associated with an increased risk for sports-related injuries in high school athletes, and also associated with an almost 3-fold risk of in adolescents of work-related injuries requiring medical care. So obviously, car crashes are a huge issue, but there are these other safety concerns as well. In terms of academic performance, there's a negative effect on grades, on standardized test scores, particularly on tardiness levels and reduced attendance rates. And now there are several studies which have also showed that students are less likely to graduate if they don't get enough sleep and if they attend earlier starting high schools. So back in 2014, I was privileged to be the lead author of the American Academy of Pediatrics policy statement in support of delaying middle and high schools until 8:30 or later. And there are many, many organizations, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the AMA, American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, the NEA, which have also endorsed this as in the best interest of health, safety, and performance of students. But, and we don't in 2015, a national study and found that less than 1 in 5 middle and high schools in the United States start at the recommended 8:30 or later. The most recent data that I could get from Pennsylvania suggested that this was a few years ago, the average school start time was 7:48, and only about 3% of public middle and high schools started at 8:30 or later, and over 60% were starting before 8 a.m. And there are some discrepancies in terms of racial and ethnic minority groups. Students from lower SES families, students from ethnic minorities, and students who have less educated parents are more likely overall to be in earlier starting schools. So there's racial and socioeconomic disparities, and we know that those groups of children in general and adolescents get less sleep than their higher SES counterparts and white counterparts. So what happens when you change school start times? Well, the vast majority of studies have shown that bedtimes either remain the same or just shift later by a few minutes, or in a couple of studies, including 2 that we were involved in independent schools, actually shift earlier. So in one of the schools we looked at that had a half an hour change in school start time from 8 to 8:30, on average, the students got 50 minutes more sleep, and we did not expect that. So we don't know why for sure that happened, but anecdotally what the students reported to us was, number one, that they felt so much better getting that additional half hour of sleep, that they were motivated to go to bed earlier, and they could get their work done more efficiently. Because we know that when you're sleep deprived, you sacrifice efficiency for accuracy. So you eventually get the right answer, but it takes you a lot longer to get there. So when you change school start time, students obtain significantly more sleep, including that critical morning sleep or REM-heavy sleep. The later the start time, the greater the sleep amounts, but even a 30-minute delay can result in significant improvements. But I will say that in those schools that have had a shorter shift in start times, it's really critical that they move to that 8:30. And that's really seems to be the sweet spot in terms of alignment with circadian rhythms, if that's possible. More sleep is always good, but if you can achieve circadian alignment, that's even better. And as a result of all this, students report less daytime sleepiness, falling asleep in class, doing homework, etc. Attendance improves, tardiness rates drop, dropout rates decline, standardized test scores improve, grades improved, and again, disadvantaged students may benefit even more, that there seems to be larger effects of changing school start times for students who are in the lower end of grade distribution, for example. Delayed school start times are also associated with, in virtually every study, with improvements in mood, and fewer students reporting feeling depressed. That's a universal across the board finding. One of our studies looked at visits to the school health center and found a decrease in fatigue-related visits to the health center. And just to share a little bit more in detail about the safety issues. So this first study in Kentucky, which a district went from 7:30 to an 8:40 start time, and the percent of teens involved in car crashes decreased by 16%, in that district compared to an increase of 9% in the rest of the state. In another study in Virginia, they compared two adjacent counties which were very similar sociodemographically. One started at 720, the other at 840. The earlier starting school district had a 40% higher adolescent crash rate, and the peaks were an hour earlier in the morning, as you might imagine. A study that was published in 2014 by the CDC found a reduction in crash rates in 16 to 18-year-olds, depending on the state that they were looking at, the district, by as much as 65 to 70%. It's hard to imagine another public health intervention which would have that big an impact. And a study that we are just in the process of analyzing the data on, this was in Virginia, in Fairfax County, which changed their start time from 7:20 to 8:10, was associated with a reduction in overall motor vehicle crashes. So we looked at the 2 years before the start time change and the 2 years after the start time change. And so there was a reduction in Fairfax County in overall crashes and also specifically in distraction-related crashes. But there was no significant difference or change in the rest of the state. So we can't show cause and effect here. This is correlational data, but the evidence is all in the same direction, and it's mounting. This was an interesting study that was done by the RAND Corporation in 2017, and I know that you're not in Pennsylvania contemplating doing statewide changes in school start times. But this particular study modeled the potential economic gains for each state, or for 48 of the 50 states, that would occur as a result of shifting start times to 8:30 or later. And they looked at the cost of doing that, which was about, they estimated, $150 per student per year, largely related to transportation costs. And they also added on an upfront school infrastructure cost of $110,000. So that was the cost, and the benefits were improved academic achievement, improved graduation rates, eventually resulting in increased lifetime earning potential, and also the benefit of reduced car crashes, hospitalizations related to that, etc. And so the economic gain was estimated annually to be about $9.3 billion. And if Pennsylvania were to institute a statewide change, they would more than break even after 5 years. And by 10 years, there would be a $2 return for every dollar spent. Food for thought, California actually passed a resolution to delay school start times to 8:30 or later. Just this past year, unfortunately, Governor Jerry Brown vetoed the bill. But there are many states that are taking this approach to looking at this issue, because all of the districts like yourselves are struggling with a lot of the same issues. And all the time and effort that you all have put into this, and the thought and the consideration, is very considerable. This is all on a volunteer basis. So I know well that communities and districts take this issue very, very seriously and are very thoughtful about it. I just wanted to say a couple words about elementary school start times. So we don't know as much about this. I'll be the first one to admit it. But we do know some things. We know that sleep needs are typically 9 to 12 hours, with younger kids needing at the higher end of sleep. We also know that most elementary school children have what we call a morningness preference. So as opposed to the adolescents, which have this shift towards eveningness, that most, not all, but most elementary school students tend to be morning larks. Certainly we know that there are a number of competing priorities for sleep in elementary school students, as well as middle and high school students. But, as opposed to adolescents, they are biologically, environmentally, and socially more amenable to manipulation of bedtimes, i.e. moving their sleep onset earlier, if required. Is there a sweet spot for school start times for elementary school students? Data is a bit mixed, but it's probably somewhere between 7:30 and 9. And there are, of course, issues of civil twilight, younger students waiting for the bus in the dark, safety concerns. But let me share a little bit of data from a study that actually looked at what's called the flip strategy. So this was a scenario where high school students were delayed from 7:30 to 8:15. And in order to have that work out in that particular community, students in grades 3 through 5 were advanced. So they were moved from a start time of 8:20 to 7:45. So as a result of these two changes, as you might imagine, the high school students got about 35 more minutes sleep on average. Interestingly, the fourth and fifth graders got slightly less sleep on average by about 4 and 9 minutes respectively. And the third graders actually got 24 more minutes of sleep because their bedtimes moved substantially earlier. And there were no differences in behavioral measures. They looked at a number of teacher and parent-reported behaviors before and after in the elementary school-age students. And actually, in this study, more important factor in determining when these children went to bed than start times was use of electronics in the evening. That was a more important determinant than what time the school started. So what are some of the lessons that have been learned from other school districts that have successfully done this throughout the country? Certainly, the support, the active support of the district superintendent and the general school leadership is extremely critical. The involvement of the school board, obviously, very important, as well as the leadership on the principal and the teachers' groups and unions, very important as well. But as I think your community has recognized that, as Tony mentioned, this affects all aspects of the school system. And so involvement of middle and elementary principals, teachers, parents, etc. is very important. Engaging students in this process, the critical role of community education, which all of you here are testimony to that, in terms of health, safety, and academics, and the role of community engagement. And I'm glad to hear that people are giving feedback to the committee about their concerns. My group at Children's National Medical Center was involved in helping Fairfax County to make their change in high school start times. And we held over 50 one-on-one meetings with groups ranging from the janitors to there were 3 teachers unions in this school district. We have 26 high schools and 183,000 students. We worked intimately with the transportation, Office of Transportation, Parks and Recreation, the Athletic Council. So we truly recognize that there are many, many moving parts to this. And this is not an easy process for communities. It's also critical to allow adequate time for families to become informed about the change, the reasons for the change, and to be able to make sufficient plans and work schedules, daycare, prior to implementation. Every community faces different and unique challenges, but many of them are the same. So talking to other districts which are going through the same thing, and particularly those that have been successful in implementing school start times, is very, very helpful. Now, not all students are going to benefit equally. And one of the things that happened in Fairfax County was that there was an outcry from the swim parents, students who are on the swim team. We worked with the community to acknowledge their concerns, and there may be days of the week or times of the year where certain students involved in certain types of athletic activities or after-school activities may not benefit during those periods of time, but the idea here is the goal is to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of students. What I've heard over and over and over again is that the anticipation is worse than what actually happens after the start time change in terms of the impact on athletic schedules, on retention of teachers, on after-school programs, on childcare issues. And if there are challenges which materialize, which there always are going to be, that these are reduced over time. This is the right thing to do. You as a community have to decide where you want to go with this. But this is important for all students, and really will have a benefit for the community. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments, and I really appreciate your attention. So the first question is, when encouraging improved sleep hygiene practices in teens, is it more important to go to bed at the same time each night or wake up consistently at the same time each morning, including weekends and holidays? Well, both, really. But we understand the real world that teenagers aren't going to get up at 6 o'clock on Saturday and Sunday. So what I tell my patients who come in, who are absolutely exhausted because they're only getting 6 hours of sleep a night, is I talk to them about 2 different things, 2 different strategies. One is to sleep in no more than 2 hours later on the weekends, because much more than that really seems to cause problems with your circadian rhythms. The second strategy is to think about taking a nap in the afternoon. So at that dip in circadian alertness in the sort of mid to late afternoon is a time when we feel sleepy anyway. But the trick to napping is no more than a half hour. Because if you sleep for much longer than that, you're more likely to go into deep sleep. And if you try to wake up during deep sleep, you often experience what's called sleep inertia, which is this groggy, just sort of confused feeling, fuzzy, out of it feeling that can last for up to a half hour. And I'll have students tell me, well, I feel worse when I nap. So I don't know. But as a temporary, it's not a permanent solution for not getting enough sleep on a chronic level. But taking a strategic nap in the afternoon can help students recharge their batteries and then get their homework done in a more efficient manner so they can get to bed earlier. Can you cite the data for impact on academics? Well, I'm happy to provide a bibliography of references. There have been a number of studies now. The CDC study that was published in 2014 found in 5 of the 6 schools that they were able to obtain GPA data on, that grades improved after the start time change, particularly in the core subjects of math, English, social sciences, and then there are some studies which have looked at standardized test scores, improvement, and as I mentioned, it may be the students who are in the lower end of grade distribution that actually may benefit even more. I think there's somewhat of a ceiling effect for students that are very high achievers, but there are also oftentimes the students that are getting the least amount of sleep in some cases. So depending on what your priorities are in your community, of course everybody wants their kids to perform well academically and get into great colleges. And I think that definitely there is some benefit to later school start times on those sorts of parameters. If it would be helpful, I'd be happy to provide. And actually, I don't have to do that personally. If you go on the website for Start School Later, which is startschoollater.net, it's a national organization. There's branches in most of the states in the United States. They have an extensive bibliography that is organized according to what the focus of these particular research studies were. So I would refer you to that as a really wonderful resource. I've been hearing about changes in school start time for high school students for 20 years. Start times are the same now as when I was in school. Why is this finally getting so much attention and causing change? Well, because I think we have data now. Back the very first school start time changes were in the mid-90s. In Minneapolis and Edina, Minnesota, was the first district to do it and to study the impact. So we now have a lot of studies. I mean, every month there are new studies coming out about the impact of school start time change. We also understand a lot more about the importance of sleep. What I mentioned about the circadian clocks in every cell in the body, that's new information. The glymphatic system in the brain that only works during sleep, that's new information. So we have a lot more evidence now than we did 20 years ago, even 5 years ago. So I think that's one of the reasons why this is getting more attention. And I do think that when organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics comes out and says, this is in the best interest of the health of our country's youth, that's a very powerful statement. And it moves just beyond, well, this is a nice thing to do to help kids do better in school, to this, if you don't do this, this potentially can have a downstream effect on your children's health 20, 30 years, 40 years from now, in terms of cardiovascular risk and metabolic risk and brain function. There's data now to suggest that chronic insufficient sleep is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So we know that there's all kinds of bad things that can happen, and that's part of what is fueling people like me's, willingness to come out and speak to wonderful folks like yourselves, but also for more and more school districts to contemplate doing this. And that's not true in all parts of the country, but I think in Massachusetts, for example, I think there are probably at least 25 school districts that are actively contemplating this change. Around what age does the model of sleep regulation tend towards adult? That's a great question. We think probably around mid-20s. So this sort of delay in circadian phase persists through late adolescence and early adulthood. But the difference is that a lot of colleges have stopped holding 8 o'clock classes because no one shows up. High school students have no choice. Right? They can adjust their class schedule to their circadian rhythms. So college students don't get enough sleep either, but at least there's more flexibility in terms of what their schedules are. REM sleep, there are several cycles throughout the night that include REM. Yes, so the first REM period of the night is typically around 90 to 120 minutes after falling asleep. But the REM periods get longer and longer as the night goes on. And so the longest period of REM sleep, most of REM sleep is concentrated in the last third of the night. And that's why having to get up too early selectively impacts REM sleep. Good questions. Flip may result in elementary students getting on the bus before 7:30. Are earlier times for rising for children age 5 to 10 problematic? Well, I mean, that's a complicated question, and I think the things to consider are the circadian preference of elementary school children, that they tend to be morning larks, that their bedtimes are more malleable than adolescents are. Of course, you want to ensure safety, and there's the issue of civil twilight, which is the time before sunset, it's about half an hour before sunrise, where you can safely perform outdoor activities without artificial light. So you don't want younger kids to be waiting for the bus in the dark. I think there's issues both about start times that are too early, but there are also issues about start times for elementary school students that are too late. Because if you don't capitalize on the first 2 hours after they've woken up or more, where they're ready to go, they're ready to start the day, but school doesn't start until 9:30. That delays, of course, the end of school till well into the afternoon. That has some problems as well. So, again, that sweet spot for elementary school students is probably somewhere between 7:30 and 9. But do I have solid data to absolutely say that? We don't have as much data as we do in adolescence. Yeah, familiar with the work of Campbell and Feinberg. Yes, I am. I just disagree with the way that they interpret the literature is, I think, very different than most of the science researchers that are working in this area. Will I say that the data we have is perfect? No, and we need to look at other aspects of the repercussions of school start time change, but I don't agree with their fundamental theories about adolescent sleep, which frankly are a little bit out there. That's all I'll say. Evidence suggests too early start time for school days, sacrificial contributors, chronic sleep deprivation. Why would it even be a consideration to start the elementary school students earlier? I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but it depends on what you define as too early for elementary school age kids. There's too early for them in terms of getting enough sleep, and there's too early for parents. And both of those things should be taken into consideration. But I think you kind of have to weigh both of those. There's not a lot of evidence either way to suggest, for example, that a 7:30 start time for elementary school kids is bad, as long as they get enough sleep. I don't think they're not going to have the same circadian-based issues as the adolescents do, but it may mean that their bedtimes need to shift earlier. And again, the evidence suggests that that's possible to do with elementary school students in a way that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to do with adolescents. Oh boy. Typically, how long is it taking districts to enact the change? That's a great question. Well, in Fairfax County, it took 15 years. Hopefully it won't take that long. But I think they started out at a time where there wasn't nearly as much science. And there's momentum now. You know, I really like to think that we've reached a tipping point. And that we will see a day soon where if a school district, starts too early, that's going to be a black mark. It's going to be viewed as a negative thing about that school district. So there is clearly a lot of momentum about this right now. And I think it's hopefully that will continue to build. I would say on average, in the school districts that I've been working with, probably 3 years, somewhere around. Some do it faster than that, but there's sort of typically a year to 2 of debate, and then there may be a 9 to 12 month period after the decision to allow the communities to adjust, and for the actual implementation. Suicide continues to be a leading cause of death. Yes. Do you have evidence that later school start times make a difference? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we do know that self-reported depression declines significantly. The problem with suicide, with using suicide as an outcome measure, is that even though tragically it's the 3rd leading cause of death in adolescents, in a given community, it's a relatively rare occurrence. We do know in studies that have compared amounts of sleep that adolescents get with suicidal thoughts, reports of suicidal thoughts, that those 2 things are clearly linked. To then make the leap and say, well, that's going to result in lower completed suicides, it certainly makes sense that it might, but I can't tell you that there's hard data that says when you change your school start time that your adolescent suicide rate is absolutely going to go down. Again, because it's a rare occurrence to begin with in any given community. What suggestions do you have to do to address electronic use before bedtime? Yeah. Well, what our recommendation is, what I tell patients is preferably an hour before bedtime, but at least a half hour before bedtime, the electronics go off. Students will come back and say, well, all my homework is on the internet, I have to use a computer. So, trying to get your homework done earlier is important, but there are also blue light blocking apps, which you can put on your computer. One of them is called Flux, for example, but there's a bunch of them. How much that helps. The thing about being on screens is it's not just the blue light suppressing melatonin, it's that you're just cognitively engaged in doing something on a screen. I certainly think, and this is a hard sell for some adolescents, but the cell phones really need to get locked away at bedtime. Because, these kids are listening to things all night long, and they're texting their friends, and yes, they feel like they're going to miss out on something, but I think that's tremendously disruptive. And there was an interesting study, it was published maybe 2 years ago, that showed that even having the electronic devices in the bedroom turned off resulted in more fragmented sleep in adolescents. So just having them lurking in the bedroom in and of itself is disruptive to sleep. So it really is a problem. What challenges do working parents face the most difficult to mitigate when school starts earlier? What can be done to help elementary school parents? You might be a better person to answer that question. Because you know the logistical challenges in this community. And I'm not in any way downplaying. I will say again that giving enough lead time before the change actually goes into action is really important in helping families adjust. But I think that the schools can also do things in terms of addressing childcare issues that are helpful for parents as well.
So as we noted throughout the study, we know there are obstacles, and we know that there are difficulties that may be endured for our parents as we look at these different options and scenarios that may come up as we explore which start time will be best for all our students. So again, enhancing that and emphasizing there are no decisions made right at this time. Obviously, we want to take everything into consideration, and we will put that as one of our pieces to explore even further as we move forward with the study. I just want to take an opportunity to thank Dr. Owens for taking a quick trip to Philadelphia from Boston, all within less than a 12-hour period, I feel like. But I hope this was helpful to you. There were some of the questions that we have here that were not specific for Dr. Owens, somewhat to the last one, that every question we received from the community feedback, from the students and everything else, we're taking those questions and we are adding them to our frequently asked questions online on our webpage. So I please encourage you to go there and see the responses to those. But we will continue to elicit feedback from all parents, students, community members. So I encourage you again to go to that website and also share that sleep at rtsd.org web address so we can continue to hear what everyone has to say in the community. But if you would help me give me a more just round of applause for Dr. Owens.